welcome everyone to yet another program or edition of D&I One-on-One. Today we're going to be focusing on D&I or DEI data, and I'm excited to have the most brilliant ever data dude with us today, James. How do you pronounce your last name? Is it Suh?
It is Suh.
Okay, so James Suh is the COO, Chief Operating Officer of New Orchard. And I see here in the notes, this is a strategy platform company. I think you're going to actually show a little bit about that a little bit later, as well as founder of National Analytics. James and I met back in our future lives and future roles. I was at NABA, you were at NASBA, and we met at a program where we were specifically talking about D&I data and what the diversity looks like, what the metrics tell us about the profession. And that's when I learned that you were the data guy and knew all things data. And so I was excited for you to join today because this is not only something that you're good at, but it's something you're passionate about. So when we first started talking about this program, can you share with others why this is such a passion of yours?
Yeah, I think, we all kind of approach our perspectives on the world and prioritizations based on individual experiences, and particularly those as a young kid shape how we see the world, and the things that we see are important to us individually. I'm from South Korea. Immigrated when I was 6 years old. South Korea back in the early was just a hot mess from a cultural perspective. There's a lot of, between the experiences of diverse individuals within South Korea as there is in the US. And I think a lot of Asian cultures, Korea specifically, has adopted a lot of the kind of the racial and diversity tensions that existed in the US. So my sister is half Black, I'm half white, half Korean. And there in Korea specifically, I don't know if a lot of people are aware, there's a lot of tension and animosity around mixed race. There's tons of historical perspective that we don't really have time to get into, but I think having lived through that over the first 18 or so years of my life, and also seeing really deep disparities in how my life evolved versus how my sister's evolved, being very similar with the exception of a just slightly different racial background, with her being half Black, was sort of stark to me. And it was something I didn't understand as a kid, but started to become a little bit more apparent to me as I got older from a professional space. And I think joining the accounting profession from a consultative perspective back in 2010, I got to see for the first time from a very data specific perspective how to dig into and understand the sort of impact, even if it's not, overtly biased in the systems, how small variations in experience can aggregate to start having a really adverse impact on a large group of individuals. So it became a passion for me, and I think it tied in really tightly with my interest and sometimes obsession with data.
Sometimes obsession. But what I love that you put on this slide is your pet peeve. Data is plural. And you like Black Forest cake. So we can get along on the Black Forest cake thing. I'm just saying.
So I actually want to talk about that a little bit. So I don't mind how language is such an evolving piece, but when I've worked in the data space and we're digging into information and I say that data is, somebody invariably will stop me and say it's supposed to be the data are, as if that is the most important aspect of it. But I understand the English language well enough, I think, because it's a second language. And it's that semantics piece that I think that distracts from the conversation. So, and for the record, data in the US is considered a mass singular noun. So it should be singular, but that's sort of besides the point here. But it kind of gets into conversations I've had with a lot of academics when I got into the data work and talking about diversity within the profession. And I get a lot of pushback, and you'll see some of the data in this presentation or this conversation, that correlation does not equal causation. And the implication there is, if you can't prove causation, you shouldn't talk about this topic. and let's move on and discuss something else. And I think that is detrimental to progress in this particular area.
So when you say that, and one of the things, well, let's just go all the way back to D&I data. In my experience and in the work that I've done, especially even with clients today, when we talk about data, what we talk about are demographics. So a lot of times when we think we're going to do some D&I analysis, we're going to do an assessment. What we're assessing are the mix of humans. So we're assessing race, gender, if we know about it, gender identity, LGBTQ identity, because that's something someone has to willingly volunteer. It's not something we can collect. Veteran status, if you hadn't shared, I don't actually remember if you shared that in your intro, but if you haven't shared it, you don't necessarily have to volunteer. Well, you volunteer it to your employer. So what my employer knows about me is what they perceive my race to be. I'm also biracial, but the black half of me, I look black. And so the presumption is I'm black. You look at me and the presumption is I'm a woman. I am, and I identify as a woman. But so now I get put into buckets in the D&I data pool. We don't ask how high we are. We don't ask, what's your Myers-Briggs prototype. We don't personality. We don't ask what shoe size you wear or what's your educational background. And yet those are all part of our diversity composition.
Right.
And we talk about diverse people. Okay, talk about pet peeves. People diverse isn't the person. We've already talked about intersectionality on this program a couple of times, and we'll continue to talk about it because I don't think we all realize when you talk about data, and we're looking at data to try to understand the challenges, the perceptions, the approach. All of those things are informed by data, and the data isn't just demographics. So can you talk a little bit about what that means? And by the way, folks, quick sidebar, I'm in Maine for an event, which is why I'm in the strange lighting, so apologize. And I can't flip around on the slides, so we might be jumping around in the slides and paging through. But so James, while you're talking, I want to see if I can find a slide that, I don't know if there's one that it gets to the question I'm asking.
Yeah, well, let me talk about that a little bit. I think, if you step back and look at diversity, I approach diversity a little bit differently, and this is me kind of digging into my other passion, which is complexity and systems theory and things. I believe there's a lot of value in trying to understand experiential diversity, not, when you kind of break things down by gender, ethnic, age, race, educational diversity, it does become a little bit difficult because you're trying to specifically identify somebody. And if you talk about experiential diversity as a whole, and I think that's where a tremendous amount of sort of opportunity exists, that experiential diversity happens to at times correlate to race, correlate to gender, correlate to age, nationality, educational elements like that. But it doesn't always correlate to that, and sort of gives you a little bit more of a nuanced view of the world. I think the difficulty here, and it's not really related to, I think, people wanting to call out differences, but there's no other way to describe something except based on how it's different from something else. Imagine you had a bucket of marbles, and somebody wanted a very specific marble. They were all like green marbles in a thing, and there was a tiny one with a little chip on it. You would say, hey, I need the green marble, but it's that very specific one, looks almost exactly like everything else, but there's a little chip on the end. And so you identified that for how it's different from something else. And I think it's human nature. It's an easy way to communicate, but I think when you start dwelling on that difference, instead of making it a unique aspect of an individual, it's how it sort of separates you from the other person, makes you either superior or inferior. I think it becomes the issue. So, if you look at, again, experiential diversity as a sort of broader subset of diversity, and then understand that all these other elements contribute to that experience, and you look at somebody as an individual who's gone through life, who's collected something different and gained a different perspective, I think it's a little bit helpful.
Well, before you go
This,
on, I realize we're gonna get in trouble. We're 12 minutes in and we haven't asked a polling question. So let's go ahead and launch. Beryl, we're gonna launch the one that asks, how important is data in both understanding and addressing the diversity problem within the CPA profession? So now I've read the question.
Yep, that question is launched and live for everyone to answer. We leave each polling question open for about 60 seconds for you to get your votes registered in. So go ahead and answer that question now, and we'll review the results in just a minute.
So while the question is just sort of, so James, we're just going to sort of hang out here while they're answering the question. The reason I wanted to launch it is you were talking about experiential diversity. And when we think about the data traditionally and try to use that traditional view around data to address the underlying diversity problems in the pipeline, I'm guessing you're going to say to some degree, yeah, we need that data. But if we're trying to understand the problem, perhaps we are missing the point. So we'll wrap up this poll, and then I'll let you hopefully answer that.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close down this poll in 3, 2, and 1. And it looks like 51% of the audience is saying very important. Back over to you.
awesome. Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree with that. Let me add maybe a little different perspective on the answer to that. It's important, but I think it's important in its ability to ask the right questions. We can't expect to look into the data and have the data answer all the questions for us. And here's and this will get into some of the context around who is and is not a good data analyst or can be a good data analyst in an organization or to solve certain problems. If you ask most business leaders, operations executive positions that have been around for a while, made a lot of mistakes, had some successes, and you ask them what's more important, the ability to answer a question or the ability to ask a question, you will get almost universal response that the most valuable individual in an organization is the one that can ask the right questions, ask the tough questions, things that nobody else would have thought to ask. Answering a question is absolutely easy. If given enough time, enough resources, anyone can answer any question. It's just sort of how we've progressed to our point here. So the data that we
well, hold on,
looking
wait.
at,
If I can interrupt, I want to interrupt you for a quick second here, because if we're going to talk about data, the way that you just said that makes me think only if it's multiple choice. Because if you ask me to answer a question that is one where I can put in a narrative or a thought, how some people are going to interpret the question is different. So part of the magic of asking a question is asking it right, because otherwise you ask a question with a particular intention, and somebody interprets what you're asking differently. Take gender, for example. If I want to be able to determine the gender of my workforce, and I ask it in a way that somebody thinks I'm asking about gender assignment versus gender identity, the magic is in the way you ask the question. And so you just said anybody can answer a question. And while that's true, even if I don't understand your question, I've already kind of screwed up the data in a way, or that's how I'm seeing it. Is that the right way to look at this? Because is it that complicated?
So I think it depends on motivation too, right? So I have some experience in the Net Promoter Score space. I worked with a company about almost 20 years ago now, maybe 16, 17 years ago. And this was in the early days of Net Promoter Score. And I really fell in love with that concept because this was a metric that was created to help an organization understand internally what is going on. Are there issues with the business that we can address based on a customer's willingness to recommend you to people that they know that, hey, I love this so much, I'm willing to use my kind of trusted position to recommend this to friends and family. Well,
So
very shortly after
a Net Promoter Score is a number that is calculated based on the way people respond to the question, would you recommend me, essentially, right? Okay, I just wanted to explain that. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. So it's sort of the only question that's important per the research. So if you said, are you willing, and everyone's seen this come through many times, say, would you be willing to recommend AT&T, Comcast to your, friend or relative? And they ask you to rank it 0 out of a 10. If you give it a 9 or a 10, the research says these people are actually going to physically go out and recommend you to an individual. If you score a 7 or 8, these are neutral. They liked you, but not good enough to actually take the energy to recommend. But if you score below a 7, more than likely you're going to tell your colleagues, your friends, family members, hey, don't actually use this business. They're terrible. So it gives companies negative net promoter score versus positive net promoter score. So it's an indication of potential growth by word of mouth. The very quickly companies started to see the positive marketing implications of that. So the organization that I was at started to ask the net promoter score questions. It was an insurance company, just to individuals who were successfully approved for an insurance claim. If they were denied an insurance claim, they would never see the net promoter score questions. And sure enough, net promoter score would skyrocket to 70 or an 80, an unheard of number. And then it was marketed as a phenomenal net promoter score rate. I had significant issues with this approach, but that dynamic really started to sort of take hold. And now you see large numbers of organizations being very curated in how they ask net promoter score questions, which is very frustrating because I understand the research and the approach and exactly what they're doing. So anytime I see it, I get a little tinge of frustration and anxiety.
So your I'm passionate for data piece is, background is starting to show. See, everybody, I told you. The thing I'm thinking about net promoter score now is, especially when it comes to D&I, there is this tendency when people leave an organization, we're going to want to do exit surveys. And we want to look at the survey results, in particular, are the people who are from minority groups, and how are they answering these questions. And one of the things people want to know is, would you recommend a colleague to work here? This is either asked on the front end. This is sometimes asked while people are working. And when people leave, you want to try to ask a question to figure out if you can score what is driving that person to leave. And in theory, now we can calculate some magic number that tells us where we are in supporting, attracting, and retaining diverse talent. That is not a net promoter score, even though people ask a question in that same structure? Or is it a version of
I
it?
would say that, yeah, I think it's a version of the net promoter score, but understand how little value that data has. Most individuals, when they're leaving an organization, either voluntarily or involuntarily, there's oftentimes a little bit of stress and anxiety associated with that. That question implies a potential for conflict. If you say, hey, I'm leaving because I had a terrible manager, this person said A, B, or C, it's going to lead to potentially other uncomfortable conversations. So you wind up getting extreme. Somebody's like, oh, this is amazing. I love the company, but I'm moving to France. I just can't do the work. Everything was positive. Or the extreme negative, this place is a hot mess. I don't want to see any of you guys again. I hope you all, kind of burn up over the summertime. And
Wow,
all
that's
the value
extreme.
or, yeah, but, there's a lot of anger and hostility in some instances. The nuance, I think the important information in the data is sort of in the middle. So this goes to, and I put, I think one of the slides really talks about asymmetric data capture in here and the value in that piece. And this goes to
Is there a slide I
having
can show while you're talking about that you're referring to?
yes. I think it's near the end on there.
So I'm going to click
I
and you tell me when
don't
to
know if
stop
it's,
while you're talking.
yeah, keep going. Next, yeah. Sorry, asynchronous data
Oh,
capture was a previous two. Yeah. So sorry, this slide, actually, this data, I don't know if we're necessarily ready to kind of dig into this piece yet, but I just want to talk about asynchronous data capture in some context. It's
this one.
asynchronous data capture just means that you're collecting relevant pieces of information independently But a key element there is ensuring that the data is interoperable. Like one of the data sets works with a different one. So oftentimes you'll have an HR department say, hey, we want to do an exit survey. They're going to ask some questions, and maybe an operations department collects different sets of information in sales. If you have a strong data strategy and have a good sense of the value that can come out of capturing this information, then you can start applying more of an asynchronous process. So what I'm showing you on this slide, I don't necessarily want to dig into all the details, is we, in the organization that I'm at now, we actually have a survey that is really around employee engagement and employee perspective. We ask about 51 different facets of the business, and we do two different things. We ask it independent of any questions related to kind of diversity, background, job roles and responsibilities. There's a title, we look it up in a different data set. Then we just ask a indirect question about how an individual perceives the environment around them. When you ask somebody something like, hey, have you ever been the victim of racial discrimination within the job environment? It creates a level of anxiety in the respondent to either say, if I answer this and somebody sees that it's associated with me, even though we say it's anonymous, is there going to be any retribution? Am I going to have conversations? So you get either no response or sort of that middle of the road response on that side. Here, we asked indirect questions, just how do you perceive the environment around you? Do you think everyone is behaving in a certain way? Meaning, is everyone collaborative? Are the people on your team open to outside perspective? You can answer everyone, most people, about half, a couple people, or nobody in the organization. So that context, you can't tell anyone that their perspective is wrong. When we collect the information this way, we see that even some of the top performing individuals in an organization have the most negative perspective about the environment in which they operate. So it's depersonalized that side. But in a secondary data set that they may have asked a while ago, 6 months ago, or during the time of hire, we captured things like, age demographic, education, gender, ethnicity, tenure within an organization. And because we've thought through the value in having these two data sets tied together, we've created these data capture elements that can work despite having been collected asynchronously. And it's all about really reducing the emotion and the anxiety around collecting and capturing responses so you can have potential impact and gain more insights. And none of the information we've found here and that we've created answers any questions. It just tells executives, here's an area where we see problems. So you layer on top some of the results and say, how does this change based on whether we're looking at, women, men, Blacks, Hispanics, college educated versus non-college educated, work from home, whatnot. And you see some really interesting data coming out. As an example, there was a woman-owned firm in Nashville. The CEO and the president were both females, really highly experienced in the industry. Their senior leadership team had 6 people, and 3 men, 3 women. And they had said, the CEO had said, hey, this team is great. The men on the team say they really appreciate having female leadership for whatever reason. We looked into the data, and the output was there was little to no faith in the leadership among the men within the organization. So there's a dynamic, not toxic necessarily, but it exposed an area where the CEO should dig in deeper. Is she doing something different? Can she do something different? She's not asking the right questions.
So
that's
you're,
sort of the context on that.
Beryl, let's go to the polling question. I want to say it's the second one about data analytics. Sorry.
I gotcha. Let me go ahead and launch that poll question now. Question is, if given the opportunity, how successful do you think you would be in the field of data analytics?
I wanted to ask this question while you were talking about that, James, and maybe after the polling question has closed, you can speak to those challenges, because you're talking about asynchronous data collection. Number one, I worry about privacy. If I gave you information about my, demographic factors when I was hired, and now a year later you're asking me another survey and you can link up those responses, is it really anonymous? A. And then B, can you talk a little bit about the how that works? In other words, you just gave an example. You can start to look at groups in your organization by those demographic factors and notice different perceptions. And I think that's the power of some of what you're talking about. And I can see the poll's about to end. And so throwing those out there is a couple of things to touch on when we come back.
All right, let me go ahead and close this poll down. And it looks like, in sharing the results, 39%
So I actually,
somewhat successful. Go ahead.
this is perfect. Actually, there's a slide in here that has the, that actually specifically talks about this. I think it's intro, maybe slide 6, slide 5 or 6.
What are the pretty colors on it?
There's a circle with 5 different bullet points on there.
This one?
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Okay.
So this one's actually really interesting to me. You know, when I got into the data profession, this is in the late 90s, I didn't actually or necessarily have access to data analysts to help me answer questions, but I understood the value in data of answering the question. So I started to just teach myself over time how to do the work, build access databases and visualizations, trending, forecasting, and whatnot. Over time, as I had started to look for data analysts within an organization to help, they invariably fell within the IT department. And this kind of goes to a few of the other things we talked about. I couldn't get them to provide me their own perspective. The interaction typically went, hey, help me analyze this data. And then they would say, well, what do you need? Well, I don't know. I just want to kind of dig into it. Well, I can't do anything unless you tell me specifically what you need. So a CEO or an executive in an organization will say, hey, can you tell me how much revenue we made on a month-to-month basis and if we had a net profit? That's fantastic. There's not really a lot of insight. Really, anyone can do that. It's great if it's in a graph, but not otherwise. So I found over time that the people I brought into the data profession had almost no technical expertise. And I can't stress this to you enough.
Did you say
there was
tactical?
An individual I hired into the firm.
You said
technical expertise.
Oh, technical. Got it.
Technical expertise. There was a young gentleman I hired into the firm. I think he was maybe in his mid-20s, working at a a Belk or something like that, and selling clothes. I think he managed or supervised like the women's clothing department, and had a sports degree. But he was just an exceptionally curious individual, and he was eager to learn. So he came into the org, and I actually put him through an assessment, and he wound up just blowing everyone out of the water. And I'll tell you about the assessment in a second, but the areas that I put on here, you have to have some math aptitude. You just can't get away with not having it. But if you're in accounting, you have more than enough math aptitude to be really exceptional at this. You have to be curious. A lot of the technical individuals that do the analysis, the curiosity extends as far as understanding what your question is, but not taking that and looking anything further than that. I have a systems orientation. This isn't a mechanical databases, data warehouse systems, but it's really how the pieces fit together. If you see a trend or a data point in operations, understanding how that impact marketing or finance or customer experience side, because you can sort of see that connection there. Storytelling, you have to be able to tell a story, the so what component. And the problem focused piece, I think this is the most important one, and kind of goes back to what we've said before, the ability to approach this from a problem first perspective. I want to fully understand the problem versus I want to fully answer the question. And I had an assessment. I continue to do this when I'm looking for individuals, but I asked individuals, hey, if you're interested in data or joining the team, I need you to go out and find the interment data for the Nashville City Cemetery. It's roughly from 1800 to 1970. And tell me the story of Nashville using the data set. That's the extent of my directions or guidance to the individual. And the variety of and type of responses is incredible, but you can very quickly tell where individuals focus. Is it on the value? Because there's an unbelievable tapestry of information that kind of comes in or out of that data. You could tell all the historical context, the cholera outbreaks, the racial tensions, aspects like that. The genuine data analysts, they cleaned the data set and they told me how many people died every single year. Okay, so what? That tells me nothing. I could have done that just by looking at the numbers. So My two best data analysts, I was one of the individuals. The other one had a bachelor's and master's degree in accounting, and he had been working the profession for 2 or 3 years. Incredible talent in that space, but just didn't see himself moving down the CPA pathway, and he switched over about 7 years ago into the data side, and he has been one of the most remarkably talented individuals I've ever worked with in the data space. And he would have never thought himself as a data analyst going into this side, but he's creating kinds of value that nobody else would have expected. I'd actually
This makes
kind of
it
like to
sound.
go.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I'd
No,
love
go
to hear
ahead.
your question before. I think we should do the first polling question next
Yeah.
before we dive
Sure.
into another part. But yeah,
I was
there's
curious
a
about that
polling
too, actually.
question. Yeah.
Progress?
And because I want to start digging into this a little bit, it's a polling question about how much progress do you think the accounting profession has made in the area of diversity over the last 10 years?
I did go ahead and launch that polling question, so it's live for everyone to answer. This is our third of 4 polls. I'll leave this one open for 60 seconds.
Probably have a good 25 minutes, just so you know, in terms of the time check. I don't know if you want to walk through some of these, but what I find interesting from what you just said is, number one, now I'm inherently curious. I'm curious about everything all the time. At the same time, I find some of what you're talking about a bit intimidating. And if I'm on this call, if I'm watching, and I'm trying to help my organization get started in this space, do I have to really think creatively about asking questions? Is it okay to just start with demographics? Are there different ways? Should I be looking for something other than demographics? Because that's well, duh, it's already ready information. I don't know what your thoughts on that. Um,
Yeah.
and well, I know, and I think you also want to talk to some of these slides. I guess we could talk for 3 hours, but
I'm going to close the poll real quick and then I'll let
sure.
you continue. And 45% are saying some progress. There you go.
Great. Yeah, this one has been so fascinating to me. So kind of to your question, Jina, I think if somebody believes that you can just look at data and engage in a couple of internal initiatives and say, hey, we've got a DEIB initiative and we've hired a really great DEI resource, problem solved, let's move on to the next thing. It's really sort of a fool's errand. This is a long journey, and I think just the willingness to ask the hard question, even if you don't have a means to answer it, because if you ask that enough, you're going to start seeing things as you progress through your career, through your job within the organization, that will either support or sort of detract from whatever hypothesis you have and start building around that piece. It's just not an overnight thing. I think, again, it's just comfortable asking tough questions. And when you see a data set, I've always looked at it from a kind of a little bit more of a diverse perspective anyway. So why is that? I wonder how that would look if we applied sort of race, gender, education, age, demographic into that. And oftentimes there's no difference. But when you see a stark difference, then that's curious. I wonder what will cause it. Let me ask some more questions and ask individuals around that side. But it's tough. Tough to do that on a consistent basis. But I think getting into that rhythm is really beneficial. I was sitting at a hockey game. It was a Nashville Predators hockey game. I don't know, maybe it was 10 years ago. And looked in the hockey rink. You don't see a lot of black players on hockey rinks, so I was really curious what percentage of NHL players were black, and it was 3%. So you look at that and say, hey, that is abysmal. And if you all are aware of Dr. Teresa Hammond, she wrote a book called The White Collar Profession. I think it was maybe 20 some odd years ago. And in the book, in the research, she said there are only 1% of CPAs in the United States are black. I started looking at this data more than 10 years after that book was published and assumed, as many of you all did, that at least some progress was made in this profession. And as I started exploring the information that we had available to us through multiple means, we had 0.7% of licensed CPAs in 2015 were black. Was just abysmal. And I couldn't, no, it wasn't even 1%. So we'd actually digressed from the time that she had done her research. Well, this was such a stark number to me that it just forced me and members of my team to start just digging in a little bit further, and not to answer specifically the question of why that number is what it is, but what are all the underlying factors that have sort of kind of driven into that, or kind of taken us to that. So if you get to, I think, maybe slide 7, I believe. Actually, this one's really good. Yeah. So let me talk about this one a little bit. We started digging into this, and we realized we actually had quite a few problems that we were dealing with. We know that there was lack of diversity, but most of the information we had available to us really anecdotal. Nobody had done the research. A lot of data existed in more disparate forms. There's a lack of interest in collecting it. We talked to one of the boards of accountancy in one of the states and asked if they can begin collecting information related to ethnicity, age, gender, and the individual specifically, the executive director said, we are not legally allowed to collect this information. I talked to the nursing board in the same state, and that individual said, no, absolutely not true. They just don't, it's difficult when you ask or collect information, there's an expectation of doing something with that. And then when you find results that you don't like, you have to engage in that and make some tough decisions. And I think it was easier not to collect information. That still persisted. So we found other ways to collect information. No one owned this problem, certainly not from a data perspective. And there was just no interoperability in the system. So we spent a lot of time fixing the systems and tools, but the team was incredibly motivated. We were in a fortunate position that NASBA was a gateway for a lot of information, and the relationships we had with the board, societies, universities was really, really beneficial to us. And then also, I love public data sets, public information. So we looked at the higher education database, data.gov, census information, just anything we could get our hands off of to add additional color and context. But if you can go to the next slide, we started finding some really stark things. And this is where sort of the questions lead to other questions, not necessarily the answers. So we knew the pass rates, and we started to look at the pass rate disparity between Black CPA candidates and white CPA candidates. And there's a spectrum. I think white CPA candidates or white males had the highest overall score. Black males had the lowest overall score on here, but we wanted to sort of break down these two categories to show the extremes. What this data shows you, I know it's a little bit confusing, is on the left, the years are the cohort, the year when the individual started the CPA examination. The blue represents a percentage of individuals within that cohort who have passed all 4 parts of the examination. The yellow indicates a percentage of individuals who are actively pursuing the exam. And then the black indicates individuals who have dropped out of the process. So here in 2011, when I looked in 2016, the individuals who started in 2011, 68.4% of white candidates had passed all 4 parts. And about 5% were still pursuing. Yep.
Sorry. So we're looking at a single cohort that started in 2011. Correct. And over time, by 2016, this is where that cohort stood.
Correct. Yeah, we're looking at 2016 data, but the ones that started in 2016, by the time we got to 2011, by the time we got to 2016, 68% had passed all 4 parts. For the Black CPA candidates, in those 6 years, only 35% had passed, but the other number, 14.6%, were still actively pursuing it. And this is incurring costs for review courses and the CPA exam costs on a year-by-year basis. So just sort of a double whammy on that side. This was stark information, so we started to dig deeper. And if you want to kind of go to the next slide, and this led to a few other questions and conversations with our partners outside the organizations and internally. We said, well, let's look at the other aspect of this, individuals that had dropped out. How many individuals just attempted at one time? It was too overwhelming and they just gave up on the examination. And you'll see the Caucasian students, 12.1% took one part of the exam, said, hey, this is too much, I'm going to walk away, or this just doesn't fit. 32, almost 3 times as many Black students did the exact same thing. And there's a PhD, she's actually a professor at a university out west, just a phenomenal CPA, phenomenal researcher, and a professor of the profession. She was one of the individuals who dropped, and she gave up after a single attempt at the examination and said, I can't do this. And she was fortunate enough to get mentoring and coaching to sort of pursue it again and approach it a little bit differently. And then she ultimately and very quickly wound up passing all 4 and becoming just an exceptional resource to the profession. But it's not, this was just kind of stark. So we started asking even more questions. And if you look at the next one, this is the one that was a little bit interesting because we wanted to understand, this is when the previous slide.
Oh, sorry, did it go too far? I went the wrong
Yeah.
direction.
So one more, the one after this. Yep, this one. So we wanted to understand, this is when the for-profit institutions were really coming under heavy fire, and we started to see some of the adverse effects of the data. This graph actually shows you the percent of graduates from for-profit universities that ultimately passed all 4 parts of the examination, what I'm going to call yield on this one. So on this one, 7.9% of Black CPAs that went to for-profit institutions passed all 4 parts of the examination versus a white counterparts of 41.3. What is incredible on this data set is Black students who went to the highest rated universities, the AACSB and AACSB accounting accredited universities, had lower pass rates than white students who went to for-profit institutions. This created just a really strange dynamic for us because we couldn't, from an academic perspective, understand this part. So we started digging in, and I want to kind of cut to the chase because we don't have a ton of extra time. But the next slide sort of shows you.
And I have a couple questions, just so you know.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have a couple questions going backwards, so I want to make sure we have a chance to get to those. But going forward, one more slide. Yep.
Yeah. So, and I won't get into too much detail on this one, but we found actually a lot of underlying factors. And if you look at these, lack of AP credits, lack of master's in accountancy at your university, review course, predatory institution, lack of guidance, many more attempts. This isn't specific to the Black students, but every one of these were an adverse impact for Black students. Where some students who, I'll give the argument, hey, this is not really about race, it's about socioeconomics. Understand that piece, but even when you put in that element to that, it still didn't have the overall impact. And at some point, we can dig into this a little bit further. But if you look at the AP credits specifically, or not the AP credits, for the master's in accountancy, many HBCUs in this country are prohibited from having a master's in accountancy class because it's considered a technical master. And there is a predominantly white institution within the region or the city that already has a accounting. There's a lot of pushback. I think the North Carolina A&T and UNC Greensboro are really big examples of that. We have a premier HBCU like North Carolina A&T, and for a long period, I don't know if that's still the case, they were prohibited from having an accounting program or master's program. So all of these students had to find a secondary university in order to pursue that. You saw pretty significant dropout rates.
So I'm going to go back to this slide because it raised a couple of questions. And for those who aren't familiar with the acronym, historically Black colleges and universities, that's an HBCU. So one of the questions that said, I'm confused on this chart. Are people taking 5 years to test? And then the other related question was, I'm confused as to how so many are actively pursuing in 2016 when members of the cohort had passed, unless as they pass, they are removed from the set. So I think there's just a little bit of confusion on what this set means.
Correct. Yeah, so let me explain. Sorry, it's confused. There's usually a lot more background text here. So imagine the 2011 data. That bar represents 100% of the individuals who began testing for the CPA examination in 2011. So that number never goes down. Over time, it's going to stay the same. And the only thing that changes is their status. Did they pass all 4? Are they actively pursuing? Or did they give up on the examination? And we define giving up on the exam as they hadn't taken a section in the past 18 months. So to the first question, yes, there are individuals who take an examination and try to pass for over a decade. There's somebody, I think, in the data set that had 74 attempts on the examination and still had not passed all 4 parts of the exam for a variety of reasons. So you can imagine the sort of cost implications and just a variety of other implications related to that. Yeah. Hopefully that answered the question.
I think so. And I don't think when you ask if it takes some people 5 years to take the exam, the answer is it can. And for many of us, I know for me, I sat down and took 3 of the 4 parts, passed those 3, took 1 more sitting, passed 1 more, and I was done. But that isn't the case for many people. And many people don't have the resources even to set aside the money to not necessarily work so that they can study. This is a massive effort to pass the CPA exam. And the exam itself, part of the logic behind the exam, correct me if I'm wrong here, was to create a barrier to entry, because it can't be a profession that everybody could just do it. Not that they did it to be a barrier per se, but that barrier isn't a bad thing in terms of attracting top talent and ensuring quality in those in the practice.
Yeah. But this is, I guess, maybe a little bit of a sensitive topic. So there's a cut score, and that cut score that the AICPA and NASBA will work on is to ensure that the quality stays up, but also acts as somewhat of a throttle so that the profession isn't overwhelmed with a large number of individuals who may or may not be qualified to sit for the examination. The difficulty here, and if you don't ask all the right questions and dig into the data, is based on the testing patterns. If you maintain a cut score, and let's say the cut score is 70, and I'm just tossing numbers out, I haven't been really involved in the depths of data in a number of years, and the examination over time gets more difficult, let's say, and they want to maintain the exact same pass rate, well, the types of experiences from an academic perspective you need in order to be successful in the examination tend to be based in large part on quality of education, which is based in large part on wealth, family wealth, and class or social status in that context. So if you see that separation, it will tend to disproportionately impact the underserved population groups or underrepresented population groups. So even though the same number of individuals are passing, you're going to see fewer blacks and more whites pass as a proportion. Now that's a
And we're just talking
hypothesis,
black
and
and
fair
white,
enough.
but there's a sliding scale when you
Yes,
start looking at all minorities. So it
right,
isn't just black people are disproportionately
right,
disadvantaged. But when you look at the rankings, if you will, I don't even want to say rankings. If you look at the success rates, Black and African American students tend to be at the lower end of those ratios and those statistics, and it's for the complex combination of factors we're talking about. And I think one of the things you're saying is that you can't look at a single piece of data, and we have to look at the data in a way. To me, it's almost like my brain is going deep, wide, and tall. You can't just look at it from a single slice and from a single direction. And by the way, somebody says yes, and North Carolina A&T does have a master's in accountancy
okay.
program. Sorry. Thank you, Erica. We have maybe 7 minutes, so I don't know what you want to squeeze in there. What do you want to share about some of what are clearly some confusing pieces about this, and this is just the complexity of this analysis.
Yeah, I think maybe just, some conversations. It's difficult to address this problem as an individual. It's also difficult to address this problem from the outside. And for me, I left the working with the accounting profession in a big way back in 2017. So I've sort of been on the outside. I do have a lot of perspectives around that. So the people that are going to solve this problem for the accounting profession are within the accounting profession. When I left NASBA, I think because it was a sensitive topic, and also because I spent so much time in there personally, nobody stepped in and picked up the mantle. So all of that work within NASBA just died, and the emphasis was really pushed elsewhere. And I think that's a sad piece, and not that there was an intentional decision to move away from that. But the fact that resources weren't really put to this allowed the momentum to really sort of fizzle down. And I think that it's disconcerting to me, because I feel like, looking at the right information, we were getting really closer to some of the root causes of the issues, that this is a problem that could have gained some solutions in the future. And we do a lot with sort of like dealing with the symptoms, because addressing the symptoms are really easy, but root cause gets very, very difficult. So I would just encourage the individuals on this call, if you have an interest in that, start asking questions, start looking for data sets that help you frame tough questions for the organizations, and work amongst yourselves, look for data, look for information to help at least frame the problem in a more cohesive way, and try to work towards solving it. Jina, like you're in this with me. Like, this is something we've been trying to drive towards for better part of a decade. You certainly
Yep.
longer than I have, and I feel like so little progress has been made. And I fear that if we look at the data again, that there's going to be an even lower percentage of CPAs who are Black, even lower than the 0.7%.
So Beryl, let's go ahead and launch that last polling question. And while
Perfect.
that is,
That question is launched. The question is, how familiar are you with public data sets, finding, accessing, and using? We'll leave this open for 60 seconds.
while that's
Can I
open, I
talk
was
about
thinking,
this a little bit while they're?
oh, sure, go ahead. Well, we
Yeah.
just remember we're going to
So
have Beryl cut us off in a minute just so we can close it and then keep going.
Yeah,
Perfect.
it'll just be a short. The reason I put this on here, this is really kind of taking control of your data journey. It's available out there. I would start exploring certainly data.gov and Higher Education Commission. You can answer a lot of questions on your own if you get some comfort with the data, even if individuals or organizations aren't willing to share it with you. And it's difficult not to gain a deep fascination with the potential to solve some really complex problems, whether it's within or without the accounting profession. So I encourage it. I love public data sets, and it's helped me answer tons of complex questions across a multitude of industries.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close down our fourth and final poll in 3, 2, and 1. 53% saying not familiar. So that's interesting to see. Back over to you.
I'm in the 53%. Well, that's not true. I'm familiar with them. I know how to find them, but I find it difficult to extract the data and know how to use them, especially when I download those extraordinarily large CSV files. And yeah, then I'm done.
Yeah.
Jina, it looks like the polling question got stuck on your screen. Sometimes that happens.
What
You
do
may
I
need
do?
to stop sharing and reshare your screen.
Oh, Lord, help us all. Let me see if I can do this. Stop showing application.
Yep, and then go ahead and reshare.
That work?
Yep, that worked. We're good.
Yay. Okay. One of the things I wanted to say, and then I'll leave it for you if you want to have maybe a closing comment. There is, and I might have talked about this before, but there's this concept called the curb cut. And the curb cut is something that we're all very familiar with. They're the cut in our curb so that we can drive our cars onto our driveway and we can go up on crosswalks without having to jump the curb. And those were originally designed as in one small city in California with the idea of helping people who needed that support and that assistance. But as it turns out, everybody uses them. And what we've learned from that is when you try to find a solution for a very marginalized group, it tends to serve us all. And so I think what is encouraging then is to think about looking at this data in a way that if we can identify the barriers to those who are minorities, the barriers to those who have disabilities, the barriers to those who might be socioeconomically disadvantaged, perhaps this will help the majority too. So by serving those people who are Black and brown, you might be able to help the people who are white. Saying it starkly. And I think that that's one of the things to think about is when we look at this data, we can't be just looking at the data for people of color. We got to look at the data as well for the entire group to see what it's telling us. And so that's an important part of this conversation, that we have to look at all the data. All right, so I'm going to leave it to you to close us out. You have the final word.
Yeah. So no, that's a really great context. I was reading a book around behavioral psychology, and they were going through some of the case studies. And in one of the studies, they said they were teaching individuals magic. And after the course, the individuals would leave. They would come back the next day and said, "Hey, this is remarkable. I don't know what happened, but like everything's just more vivid to me. Like the color of the sky, the background information, the trees, the scent, smells, everything's just really important to me." And the from a behavioral psychology perspective, as they looked into this, what they found is, you know, our experiences are, our perspective in the world is really shaped on experiences, and we're to focus on just every little thing that's happening in the world, right? Try to look at every single leaf, all the gravel, the sky color, all that. We would be so absolutely overwhelmed. So we have to rely the vast majority of time on our remembered perspective. So when I'm looking at the sky, 90% of it, I'm remembering what I've seen before, and then maybe I could pick up some of the 10% nuance. Individuals that had gone through that program or that class started to see
beyond that 10%.
how the sleight of hand happened and how that took so they became much more aware of that. And I think, you know, as you dig into this and start asking questions in more of the complex areas and understand the data and see how the world works in certain contexts, it just makes you generally more aware of the world around you. and gives you the ability, I think, as you had mentioned, to solve broader problems, not just the Black access to the CPA profession, but just more broadly problems, whether or not it relates to race, the accounting profession or whatnot. So I think it's just important to kind of put yourself in a position to be more observant about the world around you.
And I will add, having said all of that, it's still important for us to look at the challenges facing underrepresented groups and disenfranchised groups, because until we can address those problems, we still won't have a very diverse profession. So I didn't want to make it sound like there's this big solution, but I do think, and what I've learned from you so much, is that we have to look more deeply and at the data. We can't just keep it superficial by looking at counts and trends. Those are important indicators, but they're indicators of what? And that's what we need to explore. And so with that, I think we have 1 whole minute left. Beryl, I'll let you wrap us up, but I just want to thank everybody for joining us. And I just want to say, I'm sorry we don't have 4 more hours to really get to digging into the data, because this is complicated stuff, but thank you for hanging in there with us. Thank you, James.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you to both of you. Thank you, Jina. Thank you, James. And we appreciate having you both here with us today. And with that, we've come to the conclusion of today's webinar.